Today, it is my honor to introduce our speaker, Mr. Travis Gould, as he gives his presentation on the science and applications of generative AI in his business. For a quick background, Mr. Gould graduated from Hobart College with a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and Political Science. He is now working as Accenture's Oklahoma Business Lead. He is responsible for clients, people, the office, community involvement, and financial performance across the state. He has strategic responsibility for integrating Accenture's services to tackle his clients' most complex problems. Mr. Gould focuses on bringing continuous innovation to his clients, attracting and retaining top talent, as well as strengthening Accenture's impact on Oklahoma's communities. Now, without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Mr. Travis Gould.
Wow. Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Perfect. That was a better introduction than I could have given myself. So, well, thank you all for having me. And we're going to talk a little bit about generative AI, which I think is a great topic that we can get into. But before we do that, I wanted to ask a question. How many of you know who Accenture is and what Accenture does? Okay? Nobody, which is actually fantastic. And here's why, and I'll explain. So Accenture has 750,000 people globally, okay? We're in 129 countries. We support, I don't even know how many clients, in 38 client groups, okay? But the reason that's important is if you think of what we do, we're a consulting and services company, right? But we help our clients solve their most complex problems. But the reality of it is you don't want to hear about us, you want to hear about our clients, okay? How many of you have seen or heard of Game of Thrones? Great. Accenture did digital aspects of Game of Thrones. 2 years ago, Accenture helped a company that won the best Super Bowl ad, right? When you call into a Marriott or AT&T, you're actually talking to Accenture. Right? And so the point of this is, we're leading in a lot of industries. Our clients come to us with some of their most complex challenges. And generative AI, which we'll get into, is probably the hottest topic that I've experienced in my 23-year career. Because it's new, it's scary, it's leading. Clients are looking at how they can effectively manage and mitigate and roll out generative AI. And some of you have probably already used generative AI. How many of you have used ChatGPT? Yeah. All right. Great response. But the reality of it is, right, there are clients that have heard of this, right? They don't know what it means. They don't know the implications to their business. And so folks like me have to go home and ask our kids, what is generative AI and what are you all doing with it, right? But it does have significant impacts to the business world. And I think the world that you're coming up in, right, it's going to be normal for you, right? There's going to be things, whether you're in engineering, whether you want to go into the health field, whether you want to go be a mathematician or a teacher, right? Impacts of your life are going to be effective with generative AI, okay? And I was talking to some folks earlier about this. You all grew up in a world where you always had the web, right? You could always go out and Google something. Well, when I was in middle school, there was no web, right? And so the impacts of the World Wide Web, and I know some of you are laughing like, how old is this guy? But the impacts of the web was significant. And I would say since then, there has been other significant impacts in technology, but I'm ventured to say there'll be none as significant as generative AI. And so I want to make this very, conversational, and I've got some slides to kind of guide us through the conversation, but I want you all to ask questions, some of which I may not have the answer to, all right? Because the reality of it is this became a real hot topic for, us and our clients and our experts in the last 6 months. And, in my business, you always have to keep a pulse on what's happening in the various industries. And I would say there's none that I get a daily update on. Gen AI, I get a daily update on and what the market is doing and what people are asking and what articles have come out. You probably know a lot about this, but a lot of folks that we talk to don't understand the aspects of artificial intelligence versus machine learning versus basic automation. Okay, and the point of this is saying that in the last 10 to 15 to 20 years, all of this has come to fruition. It started with desktop, where you basically could emulate a transaction from a human, right? You then got into robotic process automation, right? Which are a series of complex transactions or human interactions. And then you get into the virtual agents, which are, agents that are acting like a human, right? So when you call and order a movie, right, and you ask a question, giving you options, right? Give me option one, right? They recognize that. That's a virtual agent, right? And then you got into artificial intelligence, right? And those aspects are machine learning. And some of you, during our lunch, we were talking about machine learning in the healthcare field, right? And our clients had just gotten used to, what machine learning is and the implications of machine learning, right? So for example, in the oil and gas field, right, we have clients that are applying machine learning to key equipment so that they can predict when it's going to break and get a maintenance crew out there before it breaks. We have another client that is looking at machine learning and taking all the data sets, right, to help them think about where they're going to drill their next mine, right? And so aspects of machine learning and the technology were relatively new to our clients. And then all of a sudden, generative AI came along. Can somebody else other than me explain to the group what is generative AI?
Utilizes like natural language modeling and models to utilize past data to create new generative patterns based on previous information already put into the model.
Yeah. That's right. Very well done. Do you want to give the rest of the talk? That's right. And I think what would be different, in addition to what was said, is it has the ability to not emulate a human. It has the ability to think like a human. Okay? And that's what's probably causing the greatest stir with our clients and industries. Right? And so you see articles like, robots now that can do your job better than you. Right? And so from the business standpoint, clients are wondering, what do I do with this? Right? And how do I roll this out? Knowing that this is coming and what they have to address it. And so there's enormous potential, right? And so the thinking like a human, emulating a human, taking large data sets, data sets that, might have taken a human a month to comb through could now be combed through with results within an hour. But I would say here's the biggest challenge, right? And we'll get into what it means for industries and specifically maybe for some of you, right? Some of the biggest challenges that come with this, and it's hard to see on the screen, is the true power of generative AI. So for example, who owns the intellectual property, right? This obviously came from intellectual property. Google was the first one out there, I think, to start with this. There's currently, court cases in Europe around who owns it, right? There's also social bias that's starting to be able to come out. So if it can emulate and think like a human, it can also have bias like a human, right? There's data security and privacy breach, right? You all have messed around with ChatGPT, but you're probably not putting in company secrets into it, right? Well, there was a company, one that you probably have heard of, in Samsung, where some of their employees were using ChatGPT to write one of their presentations that had confidential and competitive advantage information to the company that their competitors were able to steal because it was now in ChatGPT, right? And so ramifications and how you roll this out and what it means are significant, okay? But the potential is there. So it's growing. Microsoft is investing 10 billion in this. Accenture is investing 3 billion, right? And the use cases that are available for what it means for industry are endless, probably. And I think the question that we need to ask ourselves as we think about this, whether you want to be an engineer, whether you want to get into the health field, right, is how far are we going to take generative AI, right? Because it has the capability to do text, images, audio, video, all the aspects of things that are artificial intelligence, but it has the aspect to think like a human. And so you all can get a copy of these, and I'm not a big drain the slide kind of presenter. Key point here that's exciting but also scary is by 2025, 2030, they're predicting generative AI will be stronger than a human. We'll be able to think better than a human, make better decisions than a human, okay? And so you're gonna see this accelerate in the things that you all hear about and maybe even take classes on in college and think about in your industries, right? It's gonna be quick, right? There's not gonna be a slow adoption for generative AI. Let me stop there. I'm doing a lot of talking. At least at a high level, before we get into the industry specifics, what questions do you all have about generative AI? Yes, sir. I'm going to make you stand up and introduce yourself.
Okay. Hi, I'm Keith Governor, and my question about generative AI is, one, to my understanding, it relies on a large data set to actually generate data. How sustainable is that system? It's compiling large amounts of data, and how do companies actually compile and store such large data sets?
It's a great question. It's actually the number one question that our clients ask me, okay? Because a lot of the data is stored in the cloud, okay? And you all are familiar with the cloud, right? And a lot of that's a consumption-based data model, right? And so if you think about the large amount of data that's being stored, you have the cloud producers, which are the Microsofts, the AWS, the Googles of the world, that want more information in the cloud. But the number one question that comes up and where companies are hesitant to lean into generative AI is because there's cost implications of those data sets. And if I'm paid if I'm paying a cloud provider to store that and run it, right, I have to pay at times based on the drink. And so the question that comes up for clients is that sustainable and how much will it cost me in the future? Okay, so that's the number one question. The other question that I get is, how do we get started? And any questions that I have received, so companies that do trading, right? So out on the stock market, we had a conversation about that, at lunch. A lot of what at least Accenture is recommending to our clients is to start within their company landscape. So don't put things outside of their company and use it for how-to questions to start their journey. But the question around consumption is a big one. I think the answer today would be just use the cloud. But the question is that sustainable and is it affordable? And I don't think that there's been a definitive answer beyond the next couple of years figured out for that. But great question. What other questions? Yes.
So my question mainly is there any specific kind of boundary set to try to ensure that any data sets inputted into a generative AI don't have such open bias or false information?
It's a great question. In terms of security perspective, the data sets being in your own environment right now, but in terms of the biased, I would say folks are trying to figure that out, right? And so you'll start to see a lot of articles like you saw on the front that it's socially biased. And I think you've got a lot of engineers and others that are actively involved in generative AI that are coming up with solutions in order to try to address that. But right now, I think the answer is the jury's still out. But if you think about it, right, if it thinks like a human, right, all of us, for good or bad, have bias, right? And so I think that it's still TBD, but it is something that we'll keep a pulse on. But it's a great question. Other questions? Jim?
I'm Julia Chad from Oklahoma City. So my question is, there's different types of AI. One is one kind would be the creative generation, so like creating art or text. Then another kind is more focused on, say, analyzing trends. Do you think the first kind could ever become as, say, profitable as the second kind?
Interesting question. So my opinion on that, I'm probably going to answer, and I'm going to answer it honestly, probably not as profitable. And here's why, right? Because the business world, right, is really about analyzing, business numbers and trends, the stock market, et cetera, which people pour billions and billions and billions upon trillions of dollars in. That doesn't mean that, the creative side of this is not profitable at all, but I think your question was as profitable. I would say probably not, but I do think that there is a place for the creative side, and there are profitable returns in that. And I'm interested to continue to watch generative AI grow and see how it has an impact on the creative side, music, art, right? Because you can put into ChatGPT a question, right, and it'll spit out an answer, right? But if somebody's got an idea on a song they want to write, right, or a music, right, I think there's an opportunity to be advanced there and still be profitable, but probably not as profitable as the business world. But great question. Yes, sorry, saw your hand first.
Jael, so it was said that you had a background in political science earlier. How has this, in your opinion, how has the current upheaval of generative AI differed in the political scene? And could you give examples of specific regions where political division has differed?
With Gen AI? Yeah. I don't know if we've seen the ramification impacts of it in the political world yet, right? Outside of, if somebody's looking very quickly for, information on where candidates stand, you could theoretically ask ChatGPT, who should I vote for in a political race and get an opinion on. And so I think the basics and impacts on the political spectrum right now are probably not as mature as they will be 6 months from now, right? And the thing that I would, you might be saying, well, wait a second, you don't have a lot of answers on this. I think the thing that I would, suggest, right, is 6 months ago, a lot of folks didn't have any answers on this. And even our expert in Accenture was somebody that had an engineering background in technology that was pulled out, right, to focus on leading the efforts here. And so he's only an expert on generative AI, via 6 months, right? And the use cases that are starting to churn up, right, in each of the industries, whether you want to get into the medical field, oil and gas, the public sector, where you will get into the politics of it, are just starting to come to fruition. Like when he came out and met with the CFOs and CIOs here in Oklahoma City, and they were asking about use cases. And I think at the time, we may have identified 25, right? Well, 3 months later, the use cases are now 300 that we've shared publicly, which means we probably have identified more like 1,200 that we want to test out in our own sandbox. So I think outside of gathering information quickly, an opinion on who to vote for, an opinion on maybe, is this a good investment of our taxpayer dollars? I don't think we've seen a lot of implications in the political world yet. And I say yet, but great question. Other questions?
Grace Howe from Yukon. Do you think this could eventually cause job instability in the future once it becomes more advanced, once generative AI becomes more advanced?
The answer to that is it will. Okay, it'll cause jobs instability, and I think most, if not all of you, are thinking about careers in engineering or the medical field, right? Show of hands, who wants to be an engineer and who wants to be in the medical field? Right, so that's pretty much a lot of folks in the room. The good news is those fields, right? I think, the way I would describe it is there'll be disruption. However, I think the life that you're going to live in college and when you get into the professional world is working with generative AI and maybe not so much resistant to generative AI. I think where you're going to start to see implications, and let me caveat this too by whenever we see these technology trends and we say things like instability, first questions that we always get from clients are a lot of people going to lose their job? I think the answer to that here is no. I think jobs are actually going to change, right? And so things like, coders. I think you were saying earlier that you were taking Java, is that correct? Anybody that's taking coding, right? So today, you might be in there coding. With generative AI, the predictions are code can now be produced at like 50% faster than if you were just in there doing it yourself, right? It doesn't mean that we don't need coders. It just means that it's going to be faster, right? Any job that's probably more administrative in nature, so think back office corporations, right? There are some statistics that, even in our own published research, they're saying that, 50 to 60% of those jobs will be more efficient, with generative AI. But I also think with any technology trend, there's new opportunities, right? There's an article out there, and I was sharing this at lunch. So if you want to go apply for it, go apply for it. There's somebody, and I believe it was Google or Amazon, that's looking for a lead generative AI person that starts at $800,000 a year. Now, here's the reality. There's probably only 20 people in the whole United States that are actually qualified for that job. But the point of me telling you that is you're going to see things like, Gen AI developers, right? You're going to see Gen AI website, marketing people, right? And I think the point in it is there's going to be a lot of jobs that we don't even know that are going to spin out of this, but it will cause disruption and it will cause instability. So, but great question. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Brian. You had mentioned that there would be job instability and other such things from this advancement. And you said you didn't think that it would cause a lot of people to lose their jobs per se, but what about all the simpler day-to-day jobs people have? Those are routine enough that I'm sure eventually robots could do it.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the way I would, let me come back. The way I would answer that question is day-to-day administrative tasks will be implicated, right? And I don't want to give you like a scene where you're going to, walk in and you're going to see a robot at the front desk and not a human, right? But the way you need to think about it is those administrative tasks that people do will come off their plate. And so what folks always assume, right, is that job goes away. The reality of it is, 20 years ago, the answer to that question was, yeah, probably did. When we started to see things like automation come in the marketplace, even labor arbitrage, right? You all hear about, things going to other countries, China and India, right? But the reality of it is we don't see that in the data. What we see is people are going to have to adapt, right? So you have 80% of your day now open. You are now able to work on things higher up the maturity curve, right? If you're an accountant, right, as opposed to entering transactions or putting data into spreadsheets, you're now going to be analyzing, and making recommendations, which the implications in the business world, I would argue, are positive, right? Because we want people to think. You may actually have a generative AI that gives you a model that says, we think you should do this. But I think in anything that we've suggested to clients or what we're talking and recommending to clients, you still have to have the human element. It's just going to be, I think you're going to see a period of instability, back to your question, because there's just a lot of unknowns, right? And when you start deploying these use cases, freeing up people's capacity, what are you going to do with that capacity to help grow your business, your nonprofit, do more research in the medical field, right? Is I think some of the questions companies and organizations will have to answer as they go through the journey. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you. Come back. I'm going to get over that. I'll come back to you.
Hi, I'm Thomas Brakefield. What can't AI do?
That's a great question. And I may actually save that question on internal meetings when we get updates on AI. I might respond with what can it do? Things that it won't be able to do, right? Obviously, it's not going to be able to build a building, right? It's not going to be able to go operate on a human, right? Now, it may make recommendations on what you can do in your operational procedure. It may make recommendations on if you're going to be an engineer and you want to be a structural engineer. It may make recommendations on how you go about building it and what the design aspects are. But those type of jobs, are still gonna be needed. Like, and AI is not going to go replace those jobs, right? For a utility company, the folks that go out and fix poles and lines, right? AI is not going to do that, right? It may come in and make recommendations on where it thinks the problem is, but you're still going to need a human to actually go out and check the thinking on it, and the human to actually go out and fix the pole. And so the way I would frame this, back to the instability comment, which was a great question, a great way to frame it. Right, for a while, we're going to see a little instability as we as humans adapt on how to work with something that, can make very specific recommendations. But I think the message for you all is whether you're going to get in engineering or you're going to get in the medical field, I think you need to embrace the technology, knowing that it's not going to replace you. It's going to augment you, and it's going to make recommendations and maybe even find some of your research and your data analysis that you're doing for whatever field you're in quicker and faster, right? Now, again, we still have to figure out the controls to put in place, right, around the privacy and the bias and other things that are going on. But I think over time, there's going to be enough investment and focus here that they'll figure it out. But great question. I'm gonna use that on my internal one. When I get on an internal Gen AI call, I'm going to use that question.
Can I just stand back up?
No. Okay. Go for it.
Both of their points brought something up in my brain, which was, could you see, since so many people have a lot less to do, downsizing companies theme after AI does evolve to that point, and jobs being dissolved to a one-person team rather than multiple people doing the same thing? Or working in a team, however.
Yeah, I don't quite see it going to that extent. And here's why, right? Even though they're suggesting that it'll be as smart as a human and can emulate a human, right? There's still a lot of things that need team aspects and human. The word that I would use for you is human-centric, right? Technology is there to enable you, right? And there's still going to be a human-centric aspect to this. I don't think, although it can make recommendations, I think humans coming together around innovation and solving problems with input from Gen AI, right? Like even the example that I gave you where machine learning, where we had a mining company that was using machine learning to make a recommendation to where their next mine would be drilled. It wasn't like they just took the report off the printer and went out and started drilling the mine, right? They still had their engineers around and were looking at it to make sure it's what they thought based on their data. And so I don't see it to the extent, where you have a team of 10 and it's going to go to 1, right? But I think it's also the company's responsibility with the new technology to give folks opportunities to reskill themselves in other areas. And whether that's innovation, whether that's thought leadership, whether it's a new product, whatever that might be. And I think that's where I think some of the companies are going to have to get in front of this. And they're not there yet, rightfully so, because I think they're just trying to figure out what this actually is and how to use it. I'll come back to you. Let me get this gentleman here.
Western thing. So you brought up multiple concerns with AI, things like data privacy, copyright infringement, deepfakes, things like that. So where does Accenture view itself in the role of putting in regulations? Are you guys putting in internal regulations, or are you just kind of doing whatever you can until state and local governments step in and put those regulations down?
Great question. So the regulations we have put in place, one, you can't use ChatGPT, at the office for anything. Okay, if you're using generative AI, we actually have an internal sandbox, and we have policy and guidelines around what you can actually use it for. And right now it's in the experimental phase. And even we are recommending to clients to not do anything with this outside of putting policy in place, i.e. don't go out and put private company information in ChatGPT. Maybe start to do an internal sandbox themselves and base it on how-to questions, right? Where it's internally controlled within their environment until some of the things that I highlighted that are big items out there, the suing around IP, the social biases, how do you control it from a data standards and a security perspective, right? Because if you think about it, we had a great lunch conversation, right? If this thing is as smart as a human, or it's going to get there, what about hackers, right? They could use this. They could start to emulate human and think of all the scenarios that they can run where they're trying to figure out your passwords, right? Not there yet, but it's probably where it's going, right? And so the point of this is it can be, yes, used for good, but it can also be used for bad. And until some of that gets regulated and controlled a bit, we internally are not doing much outside of our own sandbox, and we are recommending to clients not to do much as well. Now, if I were to come back here in 6 months, might have a different opinion for you, but that's how fast this is moving. And you're getting daily updates on it. What are people doing? What are they experiencing? But that's at least our stance as it stands today. Thank you for the question. Other questions? Let me go here and then I'll go there.
Tommy Campbell from First Creek. So with the large data pools that they need to have, is the option of having large backdoors that they can then have opponents in a certain field flood data sets into that, whether it be because it's just on the internet or because it's in some sort of backdoor, having flooded data sets as a corporate sabotage for, when it is used for such large scale things as the stock market or as other larger, trillion-dollar industries, having corporate sabotage by way of using their crutch as a just bad place to get recommendations. Is that possible? Is that seen?
Good question. Good question. It is very possible, and that's why we're recommending, keep it in your own sandbox with your own data sets. Let me give you an example. There was an experiment done on this where it asked, who was the first president of the United States, right? And you asked it the first time, you said George Washington, right? Second time, George Washington. Seventh time, George Washington. But by the time you got to 15, it actually started giving you a different answer, right? Which means it's pulling other data, right? And data sets. And so the point in it is those type of, impacts are very real and very and very, probable at this point, which is why, extreme caution. And again, 6 months from now, some of the security around it will be figured out, but you've all Googled, right? You've Googled something, right? And you might get the first answer that's correct. And then you go down and you look at the links below, right? And you're like, this isn't the answer I was looking for, right? And so I think trying to figure out how companies are gonna control that and what data they're gonna let in is something that folks need to wrestle with. And some are there, but I would say your leading industries on this and their thinking tend to be your products companies. So folks like Nike, right? Anybody that's got to do some heavy marketing. Your public sector's probably in the middle right now, like trying to figure out what it means, what good it can do. And then your asset heavy companies, so your oil and gas companies, your utility companies, tend to be lagging, but that's because they have critical infrastructure, right? You don't want them out there being too advanced that the next thing you know, you don't have any oil or gas or electricity. And so I think it's going to have to be controlled, and the way companies are doing it right now is stay internal.
You had mentioned that with certain jobs, they'll probably be working more with the AI rather than against it, and that perhaps people in those specific jobs should embrace the advancement in technology. But with the current state of the world and how much we already use technology, do you predict like a further over-reliance on technology than what there already is as it advances?
Great question. I think the answer to that is, I would say no. And here's why I'm going to answer. The reason why in today's workforce, right, you may see some resistance to technology, and because when I was coming into the workforce, like, you didn't even have your own personal computer, right? We had to go to the college lab to do our papers, right? And then by year 3, I had my own personal computer. By year 4, I had a cell phone. I know that's hard to believe, right? So when we were, our generation that was coming up, we didn't, like the things like machine learning and artificial intelligence, I mean, those were something we saw in the movie with like The Matrix and The Terminator. It was like, yeah, that'll never happen, right? Where I think you all are aware of these trends, right? And these trends will mature, but you've all have had computers, you've had the internet, you've had cell phones, you've done machine learning modules, right? You're doing some of the coding and automation, right? This is just the maturity curve from things that you've currently learned from, where those of us that are, let's say, north of 35 may not have necessarily grew up with that and had that. And so I think you all will be more, willing to embrace the technology and the benefits that it will give you in your careers than maybe folks like myself coming out. And so, jury's still out. I could be wrong. That's just Travis's personal opinion, and we could get over-relied on technology. But I think that, given how you all have grown up a little differently than maybe myself, I think that you all will work with generative AI for the betterment of society and your individual careers. One more. I'm going to go to this gentleman here because he hasn't asked a question yet.
My name is Aaron. So you said that we'll be working with generative AI in order to do our jobs instead of them doing it for us. However, if we were to scope it into surgery, why wouldn't we be able to create a specific generative AI that would be able to use a robot in order to do all the surgery that it needs to?
It's a good question. So my answer to that question is you could have a robot doing it, right? But if I'm laying on the operating table, even with the robot doing it, I still want the surgeon in the room, right? And so that's where you kind of get into the human-centric aspect and working with the robot. So, for example, the robot could be a lot more accurate than if you're going to be a surgeon and then you. But it's like it's almost like an airplane as well, right? You have a pilot, he's sitting in the cockpit, and you have automatic pilot, right, where it's flying. But how many of you want to get on a plane that has no pilot, that just has a robot flying it? I'm not willing to sign up for that yet. And so that's my point around working with Gen AI and the automation as it matures, not replacing what a human would do.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you.